There is a year that functions as a wall. Everything on one side of it belongs to one version of America. Everything on the other side belongs to a different one. The year is 1913, and once you understand what was dismantled in that single calendar year, you will never read American history the same way again. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created. In 1913, the income tax was made permanent through the 16th Amendment. In 1913, the direct election of senators was installed through the 17th Amendment, removing the last structural check that state governments had over federal power. 3 foundational changes to the architecture of American life, all in the same 12 months. The official version of history presents these as reforms, modernizations, the natural evolution of a growing nation catching up to the demands of a complex economy. But that explanation only holds if you accept the premise underneath it. The premise that what existed before 1913 was insufficient, primitive, inadequate for a civilized society. And when you actually look at what existed before 1913, not through the textbooks written after 1913, but through the physical record, the engineering record, the financial record, and the suppressed patent record, that premise falls apart completely. Before 1913, the American federal government ran without an income tax for the overwhelming majority of its existence. Before 1913, there was no permanent central bank controlling the issuance of currency and setting the price of money for the entire economy. Before 1913, a man named Nikola Tesla had already demonstrated a system for transmitting electrical power through the ground and the atmosphere without wires, without meters, without billing infrastructure, and without the ability of any corporation to charge you for it. And before 1913, the cities of this country were filled with buildings so technically sophisticated, so perfectly executed, and so far beyond the documented construction capacity of the era that the official explanations for how they were built have never been satisfying to anyone who examines them carefully. Something existed before 1913 that the people who built 1913 needed to destroy. And they destroyed it methodically, legally, and completely. What we inherited is not the natural progression of American civilization. It is the controlled remnant of something that was taken from us in a single year. To understand what was taken, you have to go back further than 1913. You have to go back to a world that the official timeline of American history has never fully explained. A world that appears in the physical record as foundations too deep, buildings too grand, and infrastructure too advanced for the civilization that supposedly constructed it from scratch after 1776. The Tartaria hypothesis begins with a simple observation. The monumental architecture that fills the major cities of America, the courthouses, post offices, train stations, civic buildings, and exhibition halls of the late 19th century does not match the labor capacity, the material supply chains, man, or the technical expertise of the population that official history credits with building it. The population of the American Midwest in the 1840s and 1850s was sparse, agrarian, and had no tradition of constructing buildings with 40-foot ceilings, load-bearing stone facades of perfect proportion, and heating and ventilation systems whose engineering would challenge a modern contractor. And yet the buildings are there. They have always been there, and they were already old when the official record first began documenting them. The standard response to this observation is to attribute the buildings to immigrant craftsmen, to European-trained stonemasons who crossed the Atlantic and built an entirely new civilization in the American interior within a generation. But the math does not support this. The volume of stone moved, the precision of the work, the consistency of style across thousands of miles of American geography, the sheer number of structures that would have required simultaneous construction to account for the dates their official histories assign them. None of it is possible under the labor model the textbooks describe. What is possible is that these structures were already standing when the new American population arrived, that they were inherited rather than built, that the civilization whose infrastructure America occupies was not the one written into the founding documents but an older one, the one that Tartaria researchers have spent a generation documenting, that existed on this continent and across Eurasia before the reset event that erased it and installed the current historical narrative in its place. This is the context in which you have to understand what America had before 1913. Because the free energy systems, the tax-free economy, and the central bank-free financial structure of pre-1913 America were not inventions of the new American Republic. They were remnants. They were the last operating pieces of a system that had been built by a civilization that understood something about energy, about abundance, and about the relationship between a government and its people that the architects of 1913 could not allow to survive into the modern era. Start with the electricity. In 1899, Nikola Tesla began construction on Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. The stated purpose of the project, as Tesla described it to his financier, J.P. Morgan, was a global wireless communication system. But the engineering of Wardenclyffe tells a different story from the one Morgan was sold. The tower was not designed to broadcast radio signals. It was designed to resonate with the electrical charge of the Earth itself. Tesla had discovered through years of experimentation at his Colorado Springs laboratory that the planet functions as a conductor, that electrical charge moves through the ground and through the upper atmosphere in patterns that can be excited and drawn upon, and that a properly designed resonance system, a tower built to specific frequency relationships with the planet's natural electrical field, could make that energy available to any receiver tuned to the right frequency anywhere on Earth, free, unlimited, extracted from the planet's own electromagnetic field. No fuel, no combustion. No infrastructure of cables and transformers, no meter on the side of your house, no monthly bill, no corporation position between the source of energy and the people who needed it. Morgan terminates the funding when he understood what was actually being built. The question he reportedly asked Tesla, the question that has been repeated in various forms across a century of documentation, was simple. Where do you put the meter? There was no place for a meter. The system did not allow for one. Energy delivered through the Earth's own electrical field to receivers tuned to receive it could not be monitored, could not be measured per household, could not be converted into a subscription. It was, by its nature, a commons, and the financial architecture of the emerging 20th century had no place for a commons that it could not monetize. Wardenclyffe was demolished in 1917. The official reason was that the steel in the tower was needed for the war effort, but the demolition was ordered by the same financial interests that had pulled Tesla's funding 15 years earlier. And the patents, the laboratory notes, the experimental data from Colorado Springs, the full technical record of what Tesla had built and what he had proven, were seized by the United States government upon his death in 1943. Classified, removed from the public record, not released, not published, not made available to the scientific community that could have continued his work. The suppression of Tesla's energy research is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented sequence of events with named individuals, recorded financial transactions, and physical evidence in the form of a demolished tower and a classified archive. The question is not whether it happened. The question is why it mattered enough to suppress. And the answer is that a free energy system operating on Tesla's principles would have made the entire infrastructure of electrical billing, the utility companies, the meter systems, the rate structures, the regulatory capture of state power commissions, all of it unnecessary. The financial system that was being constructed in 1913 required scarcity, required metering, required the conversion of every natural resource, including the electrical field of the planet itself, into a commodity with a price and a gatekeeper. But Tesla's research did not emerge from nothing. And this is where the Tartaria connection becomes impossible to ignore for anyone who has spent time with the historical record. Tesla described his discoveries not as inventions but as rediscoveries. He spoke repeatedly about finding principles that were already present in nature, already encoded in the structure of the physical world, waiting to be recognized rather than invented. And the architecture of the buildings that dominated American cities in Tesla's era shows signs of a technology that understood exactly what Tesla was rediscovering. The domes and spires of the great civic buildings of the 19th century are not decorative. Their proportions are not arbitrary. Researchers working in the tradition of the Tartaria investigation have documented the relationship between the structural geometry of these buildings and the resonance principles that Tesla spent his career trying to explain to a scientific establishment that refused to hear him. The cupolas, the finials, the copper ornamentation, the relationship between ceiling height and floor area, the placement of water features, and the roting of water through the foundations, all of it follows a pattern that makes no sense as pure aesthetics and considerable sense as a system for drawing upon and distributing the ambient electrical field of the Earth. These buildings were receivers. The infrastructure of the pre-1913 American city was not built for the purposes the official record assigns to it. The post offices, the train stations, the exhibition halls, the grand hotels, the civic auditoriums with their enormous vaulted ceilings and their inexplicable acoustic properties, they were nodes in a system for harvesting and distributing what Tesla called free energy, what the civilization that preceded the American Republic had called something else, in a language that did not survive the reset. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is the most documented demonstration of what this system looked like in partial operation. The White City, as it was called, was powered by alternating current generators supplied by Tesla and Westinghouse. For the first time in American history, an entire complex of buildings was illuminated by electrical power at a scale that the general public could experience directly. 100,000 incandescent lights. More fountains lit from below, searchlights visible for miles. The effect on the millions of visitors who attended the exposition was described in contemporary accounts as religious, as overwhelming, as a vision of a world that seemed to exist outside normal time. But the buildings of the White City were not built for the exposition. This is the detail that the official record handles most awkwardly. The neoclassical structures that housed the exposition, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Administration Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which was at the time of its construction the largest enclosed space in the history of the world, these were described in contemporary accounts as having been constructed in less than 2 years by a workforce of tens of thousands of labourers. But the engineering required to produce them is not consistent with a 2-year timeline at any labour scale available in the 1890s. The foundations alone, the drainage systems, the structural calculations required to support the spans of the main exhibition buildings represent an engineering achievement that contemporary architects have described as beyond what should have been possible. The more probable explanation, the one that the Tartaria framework provides and the official record refuses to consider, is that these structures were not built for the 1893 exposition. They were found, inherited, existing structures from the previous civilization, cleaned, renovated, fitted with the new electrical systems and presented to the American public as proof of what human ingenuity could accomplish in 2 years of effort. The fiction of their rapid construction was part of the narrative being installed. The message was that American civilization, under the new industrial model, could produce this grandeur. The implication was that it had. One building from the White City survived. The Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It has stood for over a century. Its construction is listed officially as 1893. But its structural integrity, its foundation design, its stone composition, and the inexplicable absence of any detailed construction record have made it an object of quiet controversy among architectural historians who have examined it. Buildings constructed on the timeline and with the methods the official record describes do not typically survive a century of Chicago winters without continuous, expensive structural intervention. This one has required less than comparable structures built in the 1950s and 1960s with modern materials and modern engineering. Because it was not built in 1893, it was already old in 1893. And the civilization that built it understood something about material science, structural engineering, and the relationship between building geometry and environmental forces that we have not recovered. Now place this evidence alongside the financial record of the same period. The United States operated from its founding in 1789 until 1913 without a permanent income tax. There were temporary income taxes during the Civil War, but these were understood as emergency measures and were repealed when the emergency passed. The federal government funded itself through tariffs, excise taxes, and the sale of public land. And it did so while building the infrastructure of a continental nation, the transcontinental railroad, the postal system, the military, the federal court system, the land-grant universities, all financed without reaching into the wages of individual working people. The argument that this was only possible because government was smaller is partially true. but it obscures something important. The government was smaller in part because it did not need to be large. The infrastructure it would otherwise have needed to build and maintain was already there. The grand buildings that housed the federal functions were not built at federal expense in the 19th century because they did not need to be built. They were occupied. The post offices and courthouses and custom houses that appear in city after city across America, mine were built in a consistent neoclassical style far beyond the economic means of the communities they served, were not expensive new construction. They were repurposed existing structures given new institutional identities. The income tax, when it came in 1913, came at exactly the moment when the inheritance of the previous civilization was being fully transferred into private hands, when the cost of maintaining the pretense of the new construction narrative was mounting, and when the financial system being installed required a guaranteed revenue stream that could not be interrupted by a bad harvest or a trade depression. The income tax was not a reform. It was the installation of a permanent extraction mechanism. A pipeline from the labor of every working person in America directly into the financial system being constructed around the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve itself, created by the Federal Reserve Act signed into law in December 1913, is the clearest example of what 1913 actually accomplished. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States had a financial system in which money was, however imperfectly, tied to physical commodities. Gold and silver served as the anchor. The expansion of the money supply was constrained by the supply of metal. This created instability. The panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 were real events with real consequences. But the instability was the instability of a system that could not infinitely expand. The Federal Reserve replaced that constraint with a system managed by a private institution, owned by member banks accountable to no elected body, with the authority to expand the money supply at will and to charge interest to the government for the use of its own currency. The framing that justified the Federal Reserve was the 1907 panic. The argument was that a lender of last resort was needed, that the volatility of the pre-1913 financial system endangered ordinary Americans, and that a central bank would provide stability. But the 1907 panic was not a spontaneous event. It was a managed event. The contraction of credit that produced the panic was orchestrated by the same financial interests, who then used the panic as justification for the central banking system that gave them permanent institutional control over the American economy. The man who managed the 1907 panic response, who served as the de facto central bank in the absence of an official one, was J.P. Morgan. The same J.P. Morgan who had pulled Tesla's funding 8 years earlier, when he understood that free energy had no place in the economy Morgan was building. The connections are not coincidental, they are architectural. The system installed in 1913 required the suppression of free energy, the permanent extraction of labor income through taxation, and the privatization of currency issuance through a central bank. Each piece was necessary for the others. A population with access to free energy and no income tax would have had the economic independence to resist the financial system being installed. A financial system without control of currency issuance could not have sustained the debt structure that the 20th century required. The three elements of 1913 were a single coordinated action. Not three separate reforms, but one installation. And what was being installed over was not a primitive economy fumbling toward modernity. It was the last functioning remnant of something genuinely different. A system in which the infrastructure of civilization, the buildings, the energy, the water systems, the transportation networks, had been built by a predecessor civilization at a scale and with a technical sophistication that the new system could not replicate, could only inherit, and eventually could only strip. Look at what happened to the American infrastructure in the century after 1913. The grand civic buildings of the pre-1913 era have required constant expensive maintenance. Why? The ones that have been demolished were demolished not because they were structurally unsound, but because maintaining them had become economically impractical. Their replacements, the federal buildings, courthouses, and post offices built in the 20th century, are universally inferior in every measurable dimension except cost efficiency. The craftsmanship is gone, the proportions are wrong, the materials are industrial and impermanent. The buildings that replace the inherited architecture of the previous civilization are buildings designed for a civilization that does not intend to last. The water systems are the most dramatic example. The aqueducts, cisterns, and water distribution networks of the major American cities, the ones documented as having been constructed in the mid-19th century, represent engineering achievements that contemporary contractors cannot explain at the labor costs and timeline the official record assigns to them. New York's Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, is a 41-mile gravity-fed water delivery system built to tolerances that modern survey equipment can barely improve upon. The workforce that built it, according to the official record, was composed primarily of Irish immigrant labourers working with hand tools in a landscape with no existing road system to deliver materials. The engineering precision of the result is incompatible with that construction method. The aqueduct was not built in 1842. It was found in 1842 and put into service. The documentation of its construction is a record of its adoption into the new system, not of its original creation. This is the pattern that Tartaria researchers have documented across the infrastructure of the American continent. The official record describes adoption as construction, describes occupancy as building, installs a new origin story on top of a physical reality that preceded the story by centuries. The energy that flowed through this inherited infrastructure before Tesla was suppressed and before 1913 closed the door on the remnant system was not the commodity energy of the 20th century. The buildings that received it were designed for it. The relationship between the pre-1913 American city and its energy supply was fundamentally different from anything that came after, and the people who lived in those cities before the income tax converted their labor into a permanent resource for extraction, and before the Federal Reserve converted their savings into instruments of debt, inhabited an economic relationship with their civilization that the post-1913 world has systematically made unthinkable. This is what the Tartaria hypothesis means when it describes a reset, not a sudden catastrophe that erased everything overnight. A controlled demolition conducted over decades that replaced one civilization's infrastructure with another civilization's control systems while maintaining just enough continuity to prevent the transition from being recognized as a replacement. The buildings remained, the aqueducts remained, the roads remained, but the energy system that animated them was suppressed. The financial system that had allowed the population to live without systematic extraction was dismantled, and the institutional framework that could have preserved the knowledge of what had existed was replaced with institutions whose founding mission was to install the new definitions: the Smithsonian, the Federal Reserve, the IRS, the American Bar Association, formalized in its modern structure in 1878, and used throughout the post-reset period to control access to the legal system that adjudicated the new property relationships, all of them creatures of the reset window, all of them installed in the decades bracketing 1913, all of them serving the same function that Lyell's principles of geology served for the physical record, establishing the definitions, installing the authorities, waiting for the people who remembered what things had actually been to die. The people who designed 1913 were not idiots. They were not greedy men making impulsive decisions about short-term profit. They were builders of a system designed to last, and it has lasted. The income tax is still in place. The Federal Reserve still issues currency. The free energy research that Tesla began remains classified. The buildings of the previous civilization are still standing, slowly being demolished and replaced, misidentified and misattributed, stripped of the copper ornamentation and the resonant geometry that made them function as more than buildings. But the record remains. The paintings still show the wrong-coloured sky. The buildings still show proportions that no 19th century labour force could have produced. The aqueducts still flow with intolerances that no 19th century survey crew could have achieved. The patents still show what Tesla was building and why it had to be stopped. The financial record still shows a country that functioned for over a century without a mechanism for extracting labour income and without a private institution controlling the creation of money. The record remains, and anyone who reads it carefully enough reaches the same conclusion. What America had before 1913 was not a primitive version of what came after. It was a different thing entirely, a remnant of a civilization that had solved problems we are still pretending are unsolvable, that had built infrastructure we are still pretending was built by men with wheelbarrows and hand chisels. That had understood energy in a way we are still pretending Nikola Tesla invented from nothing in a Colorado Springs laboratory. The year 1913 did not modernize America. It enclosed it. It converted the commons into property. It converted free energy into a commodity. It converted the labor of every working person into a taxable resource. It converted the currency from a representation of physical value into an instrument of debt. And it did all of this in a single year, with legal instruments ratified by a political process announced openly in newspapers that recorded it all and understood almost none of it. Go to your nearest federal building, the old one, the one with the stone facade and the columns and the ceilings that make you feel like you have walked into something that was not built for human proportions. Stand in it. Look at the stonework. Ask yourself, who cut those stones, who moved them, who placed them with that precision in that timeline with those tools? Read the official plaque that tells you when it was built and by whom. And then ask yourself whether the story on the plaque is an origin or an adoption, because the answer changes everything. The answer tells you that what was taken in 1913 was not just a tax policy or a banking structure or a set of energy patents. What was taken was the inheritance, the material legacy of a civilization that had done something we have not done, that had built something permanent, powered something freely, and organized its economy around abundance rather than scarcity. That inheritance was real, it was physical. You can stand inside it today. They did not destroy all of it. They could not. There was too much. What they destroyed was the knowledge of what it was. What they installed in its place was an explanation that made everything in front of you a product of the civilization they were building, not the one they were erasing. They made the inheritance invisible by making it explainable, by giving it a false origin, by putting a plaque on the wall that gave it a date and a builder and a reason that fit the new story. The plaque is not the building. The date on the plaque is not the age of the stone. The builder named on the plaque is not the hand that set those foundations. Before 1913, the remnant was still breathing. The free energy system was still being researched. The tax-free economy was still functioning. The currency was still anchored to something physical. The buildings were still being used for purposes closer to the ones they were built for. And the people who lived in that world had not yet been fully enrolled in the fiction that what surrounded them was their own creation. What they built in 1913 was the fence. What we inherited was the enclosure. And every generation since has been raised inside it, taught that the fence was always there, taught that the land inside it was always this small, taught that the only energy available is the energy you pay for, the only money available is the money they issue, the only income you keep is the income they permit. That is the story of 1913. Not a reform, a seizure, conducted legally, documented openly, and made invisible by the very institutions it created. If this is the first time you have heard this framing, subscribe now. Because what we have covered today is only the entry point. The buildings are still standing, the patents are still suppressed but partially visible. The financial record of the pre-1913 world is still readable in the archives that have not yet been digitized and therefore not yet been quietly edited. The next video goes into the specific buildings, the specific patents, the specific financial mechanisms of the pre-1913 system, and what they reveal about who built what and when. We go deeper, we read the physical record instead of the plaques. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and look the next time you walk past an old federal building at what it was built to do. Not what the plaque says, what the stone says. The stone is older than the story. It always has been.